Welcome to another episode of the Pellet Grill Masterclass. I am Carlos Bradley, also known as Smoke and Vine on social media. Today, the holy grail of barbecue. That's right, we are smoking a brisket. Now, if you are anything like me, when you first get a pellet smoker or a barbecue or smoker or anything like that, the meat that you are probably most excited about smoking is a brisket. But also, often it is the most intimidating piece of meat to smoke. One, typically briskets are expensive. Often you are spending up to, if not $100 for a piece of meat like this. The other thing is a brisket takes a long time to smoke. Typically, a brisket for me is around 12 hours at least. And so when you're spending that amount of time and investing that amount of time, investing that amount of money, it becomes very intimidating. You do not want to mess it up, but do not worry. Because I think there's a very good chance that I have smoked the most amount of briskets on a Camp Chef Woodwind Pro, and that's what we're gonna be using to smoke this brisket today. I have probably smoked hundreds of brisket, and I know that you're gonna leave here after this episode with the tools and the confidence to make a perfect brisket. So in this episode, my goal is to give you the most simple method possible to create great brisket every single time. We are going to start with the trim, then we're gonna get into the prep, and then tonight, late tonight, probably between 10 and 12 midnight, we are going to get this brisket on the smoker for an overnight cook. Now, there's another thing that can also seem intimidating, an overnight cook. I promise you, you're gonna leave this episode feeling confident that you can nail an overnight brisket. So, let's start with the trim. So to start this trim, we are going to start on what I would call the bottom, which is the meat side. We're gonna do a very minimal trim down there, and then we're gonna start working on this top side, the fat side also, which I would call the presentation side. You will read in certain blogs, in certain recipes, or other barbecue folks that will tell you that on a pellet grill, you should smoke your brisket fat side down. The reason for this is the fat is going to protect the brisket because there is a big heat source coming from the bottom of your pellet grill. I prefer to cook briskets on a pellet smoker, fat side up, the same way that you would do on an offset. To achieve this and to make sure that bottom is protected, we're going to smoke this on the top rack so it is not super close to that radiant heat from the bottom. So let's start trimming the bottom side. All right, so here we have the meat side. There is a bunch of silver skin on here. There are some pockets of fat. We're honestly not going to do much. This silver skin on a 12-hour smoke, it's gonna be useless. Most of it's gonna burn up. What I'm looking for is just maybe some of these hard, waxy pockets of fat, and that's what I'm gonna take off here on the bottom side. Now there is, the very first thing that you're gonna see, there is this really thick piece of fat that's always here, kind of towards the center of the brisket. We are gonna move that a little bit, and then we'll remove some of these hard pieces of fat, and that's about it. So let's get going. So one pretty much solid piece of fat that we've taken out. Now these solid pieces of fat, I'm actually gonna be saving that because we're gonna be making smoked tallow on the pellet grill with these hard, waxy pieces of fat. We're gonna do that for the first few hours of the cook, and I'm gonna show you exactly how to do that. So we're saving big pieces of fat like this. Again, there's a few hard pieces of fat up here near the point, and we're just gonna trim those off. That is going in our tallow bunch. If you want to take the extra time to get rid of some of this silver skin, you totally can. However, cooking it, as long as we're gonna cook it, all this is gonna burn up and it's not really gonna matter. Now, I think that is all that we're gonna be doing on the meat side. So let's flip it over. So with our presentation side, the fat side, really our goal is to make this as round and aerodynamic as possible. And with this being such a kind of big, chunky, just massive brisket, there's probably a fair amount of trimming that we're gonna do. Sometimes you'll get briskets that are more in between the 12 to 15 pounds on a whole packer brisket. And often those size kind of smaller briskets, there's a lot less that you have to do with the trim. First thing that I'm gonna do is look for any random weird pieces that are kind of hanging off the brisket, and we're gonna get rid of those. Now this seems like it's mostly connective tissue, so we're not gonna be saving this for our tallow. Now, we have a big hump of waxy fat over here. We're gonna slice and get that all off. That is pretty much solid waxy fat. This is gonna go into our tallow pile. So now what I'm starting to do after I've gotten some of those big pieces off, I'm gonna start shaping the brisket. It's going to seem like I am cutting a lot of this brisket off, especially down here at what's known as the flat. And yes, I am gonna trim a lot of this off. I want it to be more uniform. I want it to be more aerodynamic and more rounded. And so any of this area that's really thin, this is less thick than probably the thickness of my thumb. All of that, I'm gonna trim right off. Cut off that piece. This is still a little thin. I think we can go even more. There's kind of some weird chunks hanging off here on the side. I'm gonna do a nice straight line down that, again, is gonna give us a nice rounded cut. Gonna do the same thing over here on this side. Round it up here a little bit. So now that the overall brisket kind of has the shape that I want it to have, after I've trimmed down those sides to make it nice and rounded, now what I'm gonna start doing is slicing away at some of this top fat. What most people will say is you want about a 1/4 inch of fat on the top of your brisket. Now, to me, it's not an exact science. I'm not getting in there with a ruler. I am just wanting this to have a nice, even layer of fat around a 1/4 inch on top. There's some areas here that I can look at and easily see that there's probably an inch of fat on top of this brisket. Same thing, if I were to hold the brisket like this, I can trim down a pretty decent amount. So let's start doing that. So once you get to a point where you're doing brisket pretty frequently, this is that part that becomes almost like therapeutic. I love trimming a brisket. Again, those hard, waxy pieces, I am just taking them and throwing them into our tallow pile. What I like to do is after a few slices and trims is just kind of run my hands through, and typically your hands can feel the area that feels thicker and like it has a little harder fat, like this piece right here. Take that off. Again, we're looking for about a 1/4 inch fat cap all around, but it does not have to be an exact science. And if you cut a portion of this top fat layer and it exposes some of the skin underneath, it's not the end of the world. So don't worry about that. You are still going to have a fantastic and delicious brisket. This is really starting to look like a beautifully trimmed brisket, if I do say so myself. So there's this portion right here that it is just obvious. It is filled with a big pocket of thick fat. Now, you could get in, you could dig a little bit out. I might dig just a little bit out to show you. But what's gonna happen is you're gonna realize this basically runs all the way through the brisket. And one of the mistakes that I made when I was first starting out with barbecue and making briskets is I would try and dig everything out there, and before you know it, you have a mutilated brisket. It doesn't look pretty, and honestly, it doesn't even cook that well. This fat will not hurt the cook at all. So what I tend to do is leave most of that in, And then at the end, when we go over slicing the brisket, it's really easy to identify while you're slicing it. You just throw it out, you don't serve it to anyone, and that's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna leave that in there for the most part, and this brisket is looking done. So one of the things you'll notice is right here on this front part, there's a little bit of discoloration. Honestly, that doesn't matter. From what I've always been told, it's kind of like how it was kept at the butcher shop. It has to do with possibly some of the blood and the way that it drained, but it's all gonna cook off and it's not gonna matter much. I think we have a beautifully trimmed brisket and now we are ready to season. For our seasoning today, we are going with a very simple salt, pepper, garlic, onion, a little bit extra, but a very Texas style barbecue rub. This is Texas Hat Hanger by Rub City. So we're gonna apply this rub to the bottom, the meat side first, because that is not our presentation side. And also because of that, we're gonna not go incredibly heavy-handed on that bottom side. Then we're gonna flip it over, season this fat cap, season the presentation side, and on that side, we're gonna go really heavy-handed. So let's do it. Again, not too heavy-handed on this bottom side. It's going to be on the grill the entire time. Ooh, the rub already smells amazing. Now it's time to season this top fat cap presentation side. We are going to go very heavy-handed. Now, this is gonna be smoking for at least 12 hours. It's a big boy, so it could be going for 15 hours, 16 hours. We'll just have to see. And because of that, the longer it smokes, the potency of this rub is going to fade. And so one, I'm not worried about being too heavy-handed because 12 hours, 15 hours, 16 hours, the strength of this rub will not be as pronounced. The other thing, this was a 20-pound piece of meat. I have probably cut off 3 pounds maybe in the trim. A 17-pound piece of meat can handle a lot of rub. So let's do it. I'm gonna start with all the sides and make sure they are rubbed down adequately. The trick with this is to really just take your time. Don't be in a rush. Make sure you're getting every square inch of meat. The sides are looking pretty good. And now let's rub down the top. Again, do not be afraid of being heavy-handed. Every once in a while, go ahead and pat that in. Make sure it's adhering nice, and then add a little more rub. This is looking great. Again, making sure we have every square inch, and that is looking adequate. Now you'll notice I did not use a binder or a slather. I went with the rub straight on top of the meat. If you would like to use a binder or slather, you totally can. You could use mustard, you could use Worcestershire sauce, you could use water, you could use hot sauce, olive oil. You could really use anything that you want. The point of a slather is really to just make sure that you're binding all this rub to the brisket. I did not use one because what we're gonna do is we're gonna leave this out for a little while and we're gonna let that rub really adhere to this brisket. The brisket, the meat, is gonna start to sweat because of all this salt that's in this rub, and that rub is just gonna become one with the meat. It's gonna be fantastic. Now, I used a rub that is basically a salt and pepper rub. This is a very Texas-style smoked brisket. Can you use other rubs? Absolutely. At the end of the day, you can use whatever you want. Personally, I have even used a taco seasoning on a brisket before because I knew that I was gonna shred it up and make tacos out of it, and by the way, it was absolutely fantastic. So, you can use any rub you'd like. What I would recommend is start with pepper. Pepper and brisket are just meant to go together. You'll hear about people using 16 mesh black pepper. It's a very coarse type of pepper. It gives the brisket more surface area for bark to develop. So if you want to use another rub, do it. Use whatever rub you like and you love. Start with pepper, do a nice dusting of pepper first, and then hit it with whatever rub. Now, if the other rub that you're going to use doesn't have a lot of salt, you may want to do pepper first, then some kosher salt, and then hit it with whatever flavor you want. So this brisket is all prepped up, and now the only thing left to do is to wait. So here is what we're gonna do. We're gonna put this brisket on a big tray and we're gonna put it in the fridge until we're ready to put it in the smoker. Remember, I said I would like this brisket to go on probably between 10 and 12. With my experience cooking a low and slow brisket, we are typically looking at a 12-hour cook, give or take an hour or two. So if I put this on at 10 at night, 10 in the morning, there's a good chance it's gonna be done. Now this one's a biggie, so it could be done tomorrow at 10, 12, 1, 2. But if I get it on tonight, let's say around 10 o'clock, we should be looking good. And we're gonna get this on at 225 degrees. We're gonna be using our Naughty Wood almond pellets, and we're also gonna be using hickory wood chunks from Camp Chef. The first 3 to 4 hours is super important to get this brisket as smoky as possible. So probably from 10 to 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning, every single hour, I'm gonna be adding more wood chunks, and I'm gonna keep it low and slow at 225 degrees. After those 4 hours, I'm gonna bump it up to 250 degrees, and I'm going to go to bed. And I'm not gonna worry about this brisket until I wake up in the morning. Most pellet grills give you some great tools to monitor your brisket via Wi-Fi, and Camp Chef is no different. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put one of the Camp Chef temperature probes into the brisket tonight. We're gonna hook it up to our Wi-Fi, and if there's anything weird, if there's any big spikes in temperature, or if some reason the temperature starts to drop, we're going to be able to see that and be alerted about it on our phones. So we're bumping this up to 250 before we go to bed. We're gonna monitor the brisket. We're gonna have the Camp Chef app running on our phone, and then I'm gonna wake up at a normal time. My guess is that it's probably gonna be between 180, 190 degrees when I wake up, but we'll check back in then. Morning. It is the next day. To remind you, we put the brisket on last night at about 8:30 p.m. It is 8:30 a.m. right now. So the brisket has been rolling for 12 hours, and I got a fantastic night's sleep. Did not come downstairs once. Why? Because I was able to monitor the brisket the entire time on the Camp Chef app. Most pellet grills are going to give you some sort of connected app like this, and if you don't have that from your pellet grill, you can always buy connected Wi-Fi thermometers that you just plug into your brisket and you're able to monitor it. That is one of the most beautiful things about cooking on a pellet grill. It's the convenience. Yes, I still love building a fire, I still love smoking barbecue on an offset, but the convenience of an overnight cook, an overnight brisket without leaving your bed is pretty fantastic. So it's 8:30 in the morning right now. We have not even looked at the brisket yet. However, according to the temp, it's right at about 188 degrees. My guess is it's looking beautiful. It's looking like a dark meteorite. We're gonna go check on it right now. And because it's at 188, we're really starting to check for doneness. My guess is this brisket will probably be done in the next hour to an hour and a half. So what are we looking for when we're checking for doneness? We're really looking for that fat that has been rendering on top. When I press into that fat, I want it to feel like a wet sponge, and I want to see pools of liquid fat ooze out from where I'm pressing down. The other thing is I'm gonna start to feel it, and I'm gonna start to feel how pliable it is. When you get in, you hold up the brisket and you lift it up from the bottom, you can really start to feel that this brisket, all that connective tissue, all that fat has rendered down in there, and it just feels like this beautiful mushy pillow in your hands. Typically, I'm pulling my briskets off at about 200 degrees, give or take. There's really not a perfect number. Another really good test is if you probe that brisket with a thermometer, with a digital read thermometer, and it feels like you put that thermometer in peanut butter. That's what people refer to as probe tender. There's no give, it slides in there easily, and you know that that brisket is going to be fantastic. Now, one of the things you're gonna notice is we did not wrap this brisket. Why? I wanted to give this brisket a chance to create as much bark as possible. And sometimes that could be a challenge on a pellet grill, creating a beautiful, barky brisket the same way that you would have on an offset smoker. And because of that, when I cook a brisket, I don't wrap it. I cook it the entire time until it's done. And then when it is done, I'll bring it in here, I'll wrap it in foil, but before we wrap it up in foil, we're going to add some of that tallow into the foil, wrap it up, give it a long rest. That's how I do it. So this is what we're gonna do right now. We're gonna go out, We're gonna have a look at that brisket. It's the first time that we've seen it in 12 hours. We're gonna strain out the tallow so we separate those big chunky fat bits, and we will just be left with liquid gold. Then we're gonna take that liquid gold, we're gonna put it in the fridge, let it soften up, let it cool up. It's gonna be ready for us when we're ready to wrap that brisket. So let's go check on our brisket. Here we have our smoked tallow. So now all that we're gonna do with this tallow is we're going to strain it into this big bowl, which is gonna help us filter out all those lumpy particles, those big lumpy pieces of fat that's still in here, and all that we're gonna be left with is liquid gold. Then we're gonna put that in the fridge, we're gonna let that harden up a little bit, and then we're gonna use that tallow to add to our brisket when we wrap at the very end. It is just that simple, and you can see there's no big hard pieces of fat. All that we're left with is smoked brisket tallow. The smell already is amazing. I'm tempted to put a spoon in and have a little taste, but we're not gonna do that. We're gonna put this in the fridge, let it harden up, and I think in about an hour, we're gonna be taking that brisket off, wrapping it up. Here we go. Our brisket is done. I wish you could smell how freaking unbelievable this smells right now. Like I mentioned earlier, when you press in, it feels like a wet sponge, which means this fat here on top rendered perfectly. Now, all that we have left to do is wrap this baby in foil, in tallow, and give it a long, long rest. This is one of the reasons that I love doing overnight cooks, because it enables me to do a really long rest. It's still the morning, it's 10 a.m. We are gonna put this in to rest at 10 a.m. and we're probably not gonna slice into this until 5 or 6 p.m. tonight. It's gonna be resting for a really long time. One of the things that all of the top barbecue joints throughout Texas and really throughout, I would say, the world do, they rest their brisket. Most of them are resting their brisket for a minimum of 8 hours. So how do you rest your brisket? There's multiple ways. Now, if you were in a restaurant, you'd probably have a commercial warmer. There are food warmers that you can buy, but often they're really, really expensive. So there's a few other ways that you're able to rest a brisket for a really long time and not have it get too low in temp. One of the classic ways is to throw it in an insulated cooler, something like a Yeti. Your Yeti is probably gonna keep your brisket at a safe temp for 6 to 8 hours. Another thing, and really it's the thing that I do all the time, is I put it in my oven at the lowest setting. A lot of ovens out there will go to 165 or 170, and if you're resting your brisket for 6, 8, even 10 hours at that temp, I think you're gonna have a really, really fantastic brisket. If there's anything you get from this episode, rest your brisket for a long time. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is people cutting into their brisket after maybe only an hour rest, and you're not going to have a brisket that you're happy with if you're only resting it for an hour. Rest it for a long time. So right now what we're gonna do is we're gonna move this cutting board over, we're gonna lay out some foil, we're gonna put our tallow, our smoked beef tallow down, we're gonna put the brisket in, wrap that baby up, and then in the oven, 170 degrees, and it's gonna stay in the oven for 6 to 8 hours. Let's do it. So now we have our tallow, our smoked tallow that has been in the fridge. It's cooled. It's now a really creamy texture. We're gonna lay that down before putting our brisket down. And now we're gonna lay our brisket right on top of this, bottom side down. Beautiful. All right, let's wrap it up. The entire time that you're wrapping it, you will always want to make sure it is super tight, it is super snug. So now it's bottom side up. We're gonna wrap it one more time so it's fat side up. Now we want to make sure that all of the edges are as tight and close to that brisket as possible. We're gonna put this in the oven. It's at 170 degrees, and we're not gonna touch it until we're ready to slice it. Here we go, the moment of truth. Our brisket is done. We have been resting this brisket for 8 hours, and now it is time to see if all of our hard work has paid off. Now, I say hard work, but it was a pretty simple recipe. It was a pretty simple trim, and we slept during most of this cook. So sure, call it hard work. And again, that's the beauty of a pellet smoker. It makes it so easy. It makes it so convenient. I have a feeling this is going to be one hell of a delicious brisket. You ready? Let's do this. Whoa. I wish there was smell-o-vision. Now, just so this little bit of tallow in the foil doesn't feel left out. Now, what I think is awesome is for as many offset briskets as I've smoked, this looks like an offset brisket. Absolutely fantastic. We can tell that this is nothing but tender. Now, all we have left to do is to cut into it, try it out, and we have some extremely hungry crew members behind the cameras, and I think everyone's gonna have an enjoyable time snacking on this baby. So let's talk about cutting it. Now, all across social media, what you'll see people do is slice a brisket in half, separate the flat from the point, and then show you how juicy that flat is. Now, I understand that's a money shot, but for serving brisket, it is not the best way to cut the brisket. Once you separate those two pieces, what will happen is one side is gonna start to oxidize and it's gonna start to dry out. So what we're gonna do is we are going to start over here at the flat. We're gonna slice probably 1/4 inch slices until we get to the point. Then at the point, we're gonna turn, we're gonna cut off that big chunk of fat that we left on there. We're gonna throw that away, and then we're gonna cut slices a little bit thicker out of our point. Along the way, we're gonna evaluate how we did. Let's get into it. First thing I like to do is cut a decent slice off of this, and oh my gosh, rendered fat, incredible smoke ring, and so freaking tender. Honestly, often from this part right here, you don't see brisket as tender as that. This looks incredible. I'm gonna cut a couple slices out of that. We'll leave that right there. And now we're looking to make 1/4 inch slices until we get to our point. Just by cutting into this, I can tell that the fat has been rendered perfectly. One more slice. And now let's have a look at that point. Oh my goodness. Can you see how pink it is? Can you see how gorgeous that smoke ring looks? So again, first, we're gonna cut off this pocket of fat that is not going to do anyone any good. Wow. Now everyone knows it's that third slice that is just absolutely money. Look at how juicy, how moist that is looking. That is a good looking. We'll keep slicing them again. Probably like maybe a little less than 1 inch thick is what we're going for right here. One more big slice. And now we have a few more big burnt ends. Boom. Now these burnt ends right here are going to be by far some of the best bites of the brisket. Let's get a piece right here. Look at that. This is a piece of the flat and just absolutely tender. Probably barely have to pull it all, and it just falls apart. We're gonna try one of these pieces. If I was blindfolded, I would not be able to tell that came from the flat. Next, we're trying one of these beautiful looking burnt ends. This is the money bite right here. You ready? Oh my God, it's so rich. Seasoned perfectly, if I do say so myself. Sometimes with the burnt end, you'll get kind of a crispy part of it where it's like, maybe it was a little dried out, maybe it was a little overly crispy. That was perfection. I hope you come away from this episode feeling confident that you can cook incredible brisket on your pellet grill. In fact, you can even cook a brisket that could be confused for an offset brisket. If some of you embark on your brisket cook and you use some of the tools, some of the information that you learned in this episode, please tag us, tag me, Smoke and Vine on social, tag EmbersTV. We want to see your brisket cooks. I hope you've absolutely loved this episode. I hope you love the rest of this masterclass. And until next time, happy cooking. I'm taking this.